These are the texts that congregations that often utilize the Common Lectionary will be using beginning in Advent of this year, which starts December the 3rd. Advent on the so-called Christian calendar is the beginning of each new year. And so we start over with birth narratives of Jesus. But before we get to birth narratives, usually the first Sunday of Advent is called Second Coming Sunday, just in the vernacular. Oh yeah, Second Coming Sunday, because we really don't get to the prophecies of the birth of Jesus until Sunday number 2 in Advent, which this year will be December the 10th. But I am beginning to rethink the so-called Second Coming Sunday, and to me, it's more about the in-between time, from the time that we Christians believe was the first Advent to the whenever time of the second Advent when Jesus will return, and not so much a look toward that moment when he returns, but an understanding that we are living in the interim and how we are supposed to live in that time. Our two texts from the Old Testament today, the first one from Isaiah and the second one, which is the Psalm, are speaking of moments of desperation and moments of contrition about the behavior of the people. And I think that is a way for us to begin in our thoughts. The New Testament texts are going to take a different tact toward the in-between times, and we'll get to those, of course, in good order. A little historic word about the Isaiah text. Isaiah 64 verses 1 through 9. It's hard to know the dating of this section of Isaiah. There are two possibilities. The first possibility is that this occurred just prior to the people being released and or sent back to Israel after their time of captivity, in which case for many it caused great distress because they knew that the country that had been left behind some 80 years earlier was in utter desolation. Also because there were many of those who had been in captivity who had made great lives out of being where they were. In fact, some did not return after this time. So that's one possibility. The other is this occurs after King Cyrus lets the people go back, or maybe more accurately, sends many of the people back to redevelop that country. In either way, this is a time of change. And whenever there's a time of change, it upsets most of us. And this is a time of upsetting. So this section of Isaiah begins as a request to God. I can almost see a shaped fist, or maybe this more of a beckoning. Oh, that you would rend the heavens or tear open the heavens and come down. In other words, make your presence known so that we can see your hand in what is either taking place or is about to take place, because right now we don't see it. And then it turns into this wonderful lament that we should not sugarcoat, and I hope preachers around the country don't sugarcoat it. In true confession, I may have sugarcoated it myself in the past. I've been trying to rack my brains over what I may have done with it. But the essence of this text is that the fact that the people cannot sense God's hand in the moment, that it is God's fault as a result of allowing them to fall prey to their own sinfulness. We may want to shift that with our modern minds to say that that isn't the case, but this is clearly the perception of our prophet in this moment, that somehow God has put us in this situation because of our sinfulness. And in fact, there's a wonderful phrase that I'm very disappointed how it's interpreted in the well, I'm disappointed almost how it's interpreted everywhere. You know, sometimes instead of translations, we do get interpretations. And I wish we would get translations instead, because sometimes to me it's just the language is much richer. So in verse 7 of 64, I'm reading in the English first, and then I'm going to share with you the Hebrew. Verse 7, there is no one, speaking of the current situation that Isaiah is talking about, there's no one who calls on your name or attempts to take hold of you, for you have hidden your face from us. And here it is. And in the New Revised Standard it says, and have delivered us into the hand of our iniquity. That works, but the Hebrew, I think, gives us a better richness than delivered us into the hand of our iniquity. The Hebrew is uthmagnu be'id onu, which means you are melting us, or you are dissolving us into our own depravity, or into the hand of our depravity. Melting us. I just think that gives us a better image of oozing in, so that we are mixing with our own depravity, so that you cannot distinguish us from it. It just adds a whole graphic sense in my mind. At any rate, the text ends for us in verse 9 with a petition to God. Do not be exceedingly angry, O Lord, and do not remember iniquity, our iniquity, forever. Now consider, we are all your people. A couple of things about this. First, and I remind congregants all the time that the best way to glean our sense of God's movement is to bear ourselves before God, not just with our fears or our sinfulness, but even with our anger. Lord, I do not see you in this moment. And quite often we find in the biblical text, after this kind of opening, this exhaustive expression of our hostility toward the divine, that at the end of that open expression, we are reopened to having some sense of hope and trust in the divine, even when we do not feel it in that moment. And I think that's what we see in this text. The Psalm, Psalm 80, I'm having to look at my notes to see what our particular texts are, because I find all of these texts to be wonderfully complex, and I'm working on the fly today to determine what to put in or what to leave out, because I could spend a really long time on these four texts today. Psalm 80 is a psalm that was probably developed or massaged over time into a corporate psalm of lament. And mostly there is a leader or the priest that would read the bulk of it, but there are 3 verses in here that are clear that these are the responses of the congregation into this psalm. Also, there are 2 images of God in this. One is as shepherd, and the other is as the owner of a vineyard, both of which are images for Israel. And a third piece that may or may not make any difference to you, but it does help us to think of where the psalm originated. Early in the psalm, in the shepherd imagery, as a matter of fact. So there may be something more to that as I think about it now that would be fun to research later. Two images in the shepherd section in verses 1 and 2. The first is you who lead Joseph like a flock. And then it mentions it mentions the sons of Joseph, And then it mentions northern tribes of the 12 tribes of Israel, Ephraim, Benjamin, Manasseh, and also one further image, the cherubim. You are enthroned upon the cherubim, shine forth. That was an image from the most ancient religious site in Shiloh, which was the northern kingdom. So all of this right here with the shepherd imagery suggests to us that our author was a child of the northern kingdom, or if this is more ancient than that, then a child of those kingdoms in the north before the nation split and before it had its religious center in Jerusalem. That's probably neither here nor there, but to me it adds to the complexity in trying to understand what gave rise to the psalm. Clearly there is some great distress that has occurred on the people. So once again, if we knew where it began and why, it would help give us some understanding of the distress, but I don't know how to find that at this time. Stir up your might and come save us. And then the congregation responds, restore us, O God, let your face shine that we may be saved. That also occurs again in verse 7, then again in verse 19 at the end of the psalm. How long, O Lord of hosts, will you be angry with your people's prayers? You have fed them with the bread of tears and given them tears to drink in full measure. You make us the scorn of our neighbors. Our enemies laugh at us. That's a repetitive theme in the Psalms. My enemies are laughing. Oh, Lord, help stop their laughing by making your appearance known. So again, it's a plea for God to intervene in a way that God is not currently living in the awareness of God's people. And I think that's an important phrase, in the awareness of God's people. For every one of us in our human condition, often in our awareness, we don't experience God. But we always see at the end of these that there is this sense of hope that somehow we know in the back of our heads, in the back of our hearts, if that is a way to speak, that somehow God's at work, even when we are experiencing the absolute absence of God. Then we jump into the shepherd imagery, into the vineyard imagery, which is in the section of the psalm that's not a part of our reading for the day, which always bugs me when there are images that I think we should be attaching with. Turn again, O God of hosts, look down from heaven. That's back in verse 14. Look down from heaven and see. Have regard for this vine. Have regard for your nation that you have planted. We will never again turn back from you. Give us life and we will call on your name. And then once more the people respond, restore us, O Lord God of hosts. Let your face shine that we may be saved. And that ends the psalm. A reminder of the word save and the notion of salvation. It is a complete sense. It is political. It's not just an internal sense of the here and beyond. It is this here and now sense of life that is whole. So think about that in our in-between time, between the first Advent and the second Advent, and making life whole. I mean, look around us at any moment in time, but particularly our own moment, to where there is a war in Europe and a war in the Middle East, and what we all know is a potential threat in Asia with China and Taiwan. The world is a very unsettled place, and a psalm like this is a psalm not only a plea to God, but one of introspection. What things could your people be doing, or could your people have been doing and could be doing now in order for your presence to be more vivid and valid to everyone around the earth? So that's why I like to think of this first Sunday of Advent as this in-between time as opposed to Second Coming Sunday. Our epistle text, which carries on this theme, but I think in a more optimistic way, is 1 Corinthians, the first chapter, the first, verses 3 through 9. The first three verses are almost, or first two verses are almost always in Paul's letters part of a very standard, traditional Middle East greeting in a letter. What Paul does a little differently in his greeting and in his opening in the letter, which we see with in the next several verses, is he makes them absolutely Christian and not just the standard greeting in the Greco-Roman world. So what's going on in the early Corinthian church is an interesting dynamic. That church has grown. It probably contained early on a fairly large group of Jewish converts, which means that they had deep roots in the Hebrew text, our Old Testament. It now is gaining a fair number of converts in this highly cosmopolitan city from an enormous number of differing backgrounds. And Paul, with his great gifts, is finding a way to work with all of these kinds of people from a variety of different religious backgrounds as well as socioeconomic backgrounds. There's a clear struggle in that church on multiple layers, and I'll mention two of those layers. One is the new converts who are Gentile, who don't feel as gifted, as steeped in an awareness of the heritage of their faith. So they feel kind of like second-class citizens in the faith. That's number one, and that's something I think Paul is getting ready to address here. Maybe in a secondary way, he in our opening verses here, he's going to address the second one as well. Because this was such an eclectic culture in Corinth, there often arose people who felt that they had a special insight into the work of Christ through the Holy Spirit, an extra special insight, so that what they have gleaned is different from everybody else. In fact, there is a group in this church that go about claiming that they have received this second resurrection, so that they are far more Christ-like than everybody else, and they want to call it a second resurrection. So Paul is trying to find his way to fight against these things without putting anybody on the outs of the faith, but at the same time attempting to warn the people that they are all in this together, that once called by Christ, we are all called by Christ, and there really isn't this separation where some people value others more than they should, or value themselves more than they value others. And so in here we have 1 Corinthians 13, though I may speak with tongues, etc., etc., the greatest gift is love. That's part of the reason for Paul's writing here. So in our text today, he is reminding the people that none of them in the Corinthian church, verse 7, none of you are lacking in any spiritual gift as you wait for the revealing of our Lord Jesus Christ. And as you wait for this second coming to occur, you're not without the gifts necessary. He will strengthen you to the end, as in right now. So keep on keeping on with what you are doing as a response to the grace that Christ has given you. God is faithful. By him you were called into fellowship with his Son. So this sense of there ain't no second-class citizens in God's kingdom. You've been called in those ways you perceive your call. Keep right on going until the end of this in-between time. I really like that. And that context is worth our exploring of our own congregations in the present. Because everybody, not just those who are new to the faith or new to the congregation, but everyone has been blessed by the necessary gifts to keep on keeping on and serving through the church that Christ calls his body. Lastly is a text that I know I've preached on before, long time. I haven't ever liked this text, probably because I don't know what to really do with it. I think I'm getting a better understanding. It's Mark 13, beginning in the 24th verse. But like so many of these, it's important to see what is going on behind this text. You know, the genuine persecution of Christians probably began with Caligula in the late 30s, early 40s. I'm a little fuzzy on the dates of AD, late 30s, early 40s. Its culmination is with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And it's really kind of hard to place when this is written. Was it during this in-between period from Caligula to the destruction of the temple, or is it right after the destruction of the temple when all seems to be lost? But there is a sense of encouragement here in apocalyptic literature, which always is written with vivid images and written to give comfort to those who are in times of deep oppression and destruction. So we have these images of the coming of the Son of Man. In those days, after the suffering, the sun will be darkened. I don't think when we talk of the sun being darkened and the stars falling from the heaven, that we're necessarily thinking of an actual physical image of the destruction of the universe. We could be, but I think this is more vivid imagery to say there is a moment in time when the power of God cracks into history. You might say the birth of Jesus. You might say the resurrection of Jesus from the dead when nobody else gets resurrected by God from the dead. So there will be a time when suddenly everything the way it is, including the oppression of Christ's own people, that God will break into that and everything will change. But I don't think we're to use this as an almanac, like when you see these certain things happen, then you'll know it's about to take place. You know, we've had way too many people over the course of 2,000 years telling us that the end was at hand, haven't we? I remember some out of the 70s. I remember some as recently as 2009 or 10 that knew that the time had come. And there were even billboards put up in the eastern United States, certainly in South and North Carolina, calling us to that. But I think what Jesus says in here in verse 32 is a great reminder for all of us that our point in the in-between is not to sit around waiting on Jesus to come and make everything right. The words of Jesus here, but about that day or hour, no one knows. No one knows. Neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. And then he gives us a very brief parable, very similar to parables of the last days that we saw in Matthew, when he says, keep awake, because you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, at midnight, or at cockcrow, or at dawn, or he may find you asleep when he comes suddenly. Therefore, what I say to you, I say to all, keep awake. As in other words, keep on keeping on. Don't be lulled by looking for signs. Don't be lulled by the disheartening moment of the times, or to pull back to the words of Paul, you all have been gifted in every way to do the Lord's bidding. So that's where we are in the in-between times. We've all been gifted. So in those ways that you have been blessed, continue to be a blessing. until such time that Jesus himself says, okay, that's enough. Thank you. Enter into your blessings that I have prepared. I look forward to seeing you next week.